I grew up in Soweto, a landlocked area in Johannesburg, which is about 6 hours from the nearest beach. Growing up, we were told about how we shouldn't be in these waters. These stories varied from stories about snakes and ancestors and healers. And they were further reaffirmed at any point when we went to go play in the river and one of the kids didn't come back. A reminder of how we shouldn't be there. It's an interesting thing how, as we revisit these stories as adults, we're told that they were only told to us to protect us from the dangers that were around these waters. Except these stories never left our bodies. They grew up with us and were further reaffirmed by the drownings that happened around us. My first ever ocean experience, I remember the joy that was there, while fear silently lingered. And so when the water was at your ankles, you were doing great. And when the water got to your knees, you'd be pulled out the water because heaven forbid you get taken by these white waters. The idea of exploration was a foreign concept to us, and so we would always just splash in the shallows. Fast forward to a few years later, I was 28 years old when I first had the opportunity to see beneath the surface of these waters. 2016 in Bali. We're on this boat, and as the captain says, everyone kit up. I remember looking around. I had never been that far out to sea, and as I'm looking around, people are grabbing their snorkel gear, and the lady in front of me says, "Have you ever been snorkeling before?" And I say, "No." And she says, "Why didn't you say anything?" And I say, "I would have figured it out." It was in this moment that she gifted me the most important part of this experience. She held up the snorkel and she said, "You're going to need to breathe in and out through the snorkel. So the mask is going to cover your face, it's going to cover your eyes and your nose, so you will not be able to breathe through your nose. And so the snorkel's your friend." And a little bit later, the captain told us to jump off the boat. One, I don't know how I don't gash my head open as we jump off the boat. But two is the wild panic that happened as I touched that water. I'm drowning. As another lady turned around and said, "It's physically impossible to drown." Deep waters. And so what was interesting was, there was a conversation that followed, self to self. What's happening? You know how to swim, so why are you freaking out? Thank heaven for that moment, because as I looked beneath the surface was the most incredible colors, yellows and blues everywhere, beautiful fish and morays and shells so perfect. I couldn't believe how this all could be. And the ocean floor, it felt like she was on a stage being lit up by the most perfect lighting. It was here that I first felt a sense of belonging. I've always been a misfit, the odd one out. When I got back to South Africa, I knew that I had to go back to this feeling. And so I learned how to scuba dive, which was an incredible experience. The gift of time, witnessing the most wild and unimaginable world. And in 2018, I'll never forget this video, these 3 girls diving at the bottom of the ocean, except they did not have any tanks on their backs. And I remember thinking, what? What witchery is this? What's going on? How are they breathing? Where are their tanks? What is going on? And quick Google search, and Google said freediving. I knew that's where I wanted to be. And so from my first experience freediving, there I was, back to 2016, that feeling of home and belonging like you could never imagine. The most sacred way in which I have explored these waters. And so I knew I not only wanted to tell everybody who would listen, I wanted to teach. I wanted Black people to be able to experience this too. I actually could have been a meme. And so later on, I started the Black Mermaid Foundation. For years, I had always been the only Black person on the boat who was a guest. And so that meant there was always random commentary headed my way. Are you going to dive with all of that hair? What are you going to do with all of that hair? And then there was my hips that didn't fit so perfectly into these wetsuits. And later, but Black people don't swim, and yet there I was, sitting in the boat. Undiverse spaces can be violent, and they can be violent under the guise of jokes. Assumptions of Black people being incompetent and perhaps not capable. This hair that had been policed my entire life, about how it shows up in society. This body that looks good on everyone else but the people from whom it originates. And this Blackness that had been oppressed and marginalized for years. This Black body that had drowned many times in these seas and told pools were for whites only, was told that it had to assimilate in order to exist here. A failure to recognize that narratives around Black people in water were incomplete. It failed to tell of dispossession of ocean-facing lands and pools that were not quite for everybody. And so when we arrive at the narrative around Black people in water, it was not by mistake, and the representation that we see in ocean arenas, it's by design. Undiverse spaces can not only be violent, but they can also be exclusionary. In my experience, it was language. I was on a course on one day and everyone kept on asking questions in Afrikaans. I don't speak Afrikaans. And so English as a connector was disregarded. And so was I, as someone turned to me and said, "I'll translate to you later," almost as though I'd paid any less to be on that course. The world of firsts is not easy because it requires for normatives to expand themselves, where normatives are not one, but are multiple. So from race to class to language, a journey begins. Diverse representation in the ocean arena is the most important thing, not only for wellness and for health and the mind expansion that happens when we submerge, but for the healing that needs to happen and for ocean conservation too. And so I started the foundation for 3 reasons: to create a space for Black and brown communities to be able to access these waters without being othered, without being policed. 2, to create that needed representation on social platforms. What would it mean for me to create and create and create again until someone sees themselves there? As humans, we have a tendency of placing other people above, almost as though they walk on water. And so what would it mean to create until someone saw themselves represented? Because once we see ourselves represented, we begin to believe that we can too. And last, I wanted to normalize Black and brown bodies being water bodies too. This would allow us to expand the worlds of what we thought was possible. In careers too. Growing up, I knew that you could be a policeman, a nurse, a doctor, a lawyer. No one said you could be a marine biologist or an underwater cinematographer. No one said that you could be a dive instructor traveling the world, teaching the world how to dive. And of course in the fictional world too. And so I created Zandile Ndhlovu, a mermaid and a merman, because growing up I had never seen a Black mermaid either. And this representation was important too. Building out of nothing, worlds that had not existed before. And so what would it mean to create these worlds so that we could expand too into what is possible too? I needed to see marine biologists of color. I needed to see local ocean-facing communities hold discussions about their waters too. And so I went looking for more Black and brown people that were living in ways that I never thought possible before. And so it started with a spearfishing woman in Trinidad Tobago to a dive instructor in the Maldives who was also Muslim. And here in South Africa, a Black woman who was an oceanographer, worlds unimagined. As the conversations continued, more and more people would tune in and more people were in awe. And there was an expansion that was happening. We all could not believe what was possible for us too. I'll never forget the day I had a guest host. And as we tuned into the live from my grandmother's house, my niece was sitting next to me. And as the conversation was happening, my niece looks up at me and she says, "Mamncane, what's a marine biologist?" I loved this moment because I didn't know when she was her age. And later on, as my sister walked in from the kitchen, she had been cooking. And as she sits down, she's watching with us and she says, "That girl's a marine biologist?" And I say, "Yes." And she's like, "But she's Black." And I beamed because it was our expansion. Because all of these encounters land in and on our bodies like spaceships. They are worlds unimagined, worlds that we had never ever seen before. And so over 50 conversations later was a knitting of stories, and yet we had not arrived at the root cause of this fear. For me, here in South Africa, it said maybe it was something about that research that spoke of how trauma travels in the DNA. And when I looked at South Africa and her history with slave trade, those writings are limited, and so I didn't even know. So maybe apartheid? The segregation which led for Black people to have no access to swimming pools, and the dispossession of ocean-facing lands. But what continued in my body was the possibility of the trauma that could form from seeing family members be taken away by boats that disappeared off into these distant waters. And somewhere along this long journey, packed like sardines, if anything went wrong, more black bodies would be thrown over the boat. And then you arrive at a place, having lost your home, your family, your food, your mother tongue, a dispossession of identity as the last of your hair is shaved off. A fellow ocean advocate in Montserrat, Vita Wade, says, "Can you imagine when the smell of the ocean is the same smell as death?" The story of Black people and water is incomplete. Like Chimamanda beautifully says, "The problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete." And so I think it is all linked, and deeply believe that a few things need to happen in the unpacking of these waters. One, healing needs to happen. And perhaps it begins with representation, and in this representation, it does not end in drowning or death. Two, there needs to be a bridging, a safe space for Black and brown people to be able to access these waters for exploration in ways that we never thought possible before, without our bodies being policed. And once this happens, ownership and authority begin to come front and center, where these oceans are not only safe for our explorations, but how we enter them, how we access them, and what happens with them matters. Lastly, a holding of space for culture and tradition, recognizing that these bodies don't interface these waters the same, and so lineage matters too, because where we come from matters in our history with these waters. And once we get here, when a connection has been formed, perhaps we begin to protect these waters, because we cannot care for things that we have never seen or experienced. So the unthinkable begins to happen. A web of connections across the world, documented, creates a shift in energy. Enough for future explorers to be less afraid, but also for narratives that were incomplete to be revisited, and finally laid to rest. And if they are ever to resurface, it would be because they are now complete, but also with a little bit more respect. And so my work in the foundation centers around this, educating about oceans in landlocked areas, but also taking kids out on snorkel excursions with local ocean-facing communities, because we recognize that proximity doesn't equate to access. But also, spatial planning has not changed much since apartheid. And so we create this needed access, allowing for a safe introduction into these oceans and exploration, in hope that one day when these ocean communities are called upon, they will show up and they will protect these oceans as guardians. And they will also create a culture of exploration into these waters in ways that I never thought was possible when I was 15 years old, leading to an ending of this intergenerational fear of deep waters, but most importantly, a protecting of these waters for the generations to come. I thank you.